There is a room in Newport, Rhode Island, where a young woman was locked away until she agreed to marry a man she did not love. The Gothic Room of Marble House, with its carved oak walls and medieval atmosphere, became a cell in the summer of 1895. Outside, 325 rooms filled with 500,000 cubic feet of marble imported from 3 continents. The Gold Room blazed with $1 million worth of gold leaf. 12 acres of tropical gardens flourished in a climate that should not support them. The building had cost $11 million to construct, approximately $387 million in today's currency. This was not merely the most expensive private residence in America. It was a monument to ambition, a weapon of social dominance, and ultimately, a cage. Inside that Gothic room, a mother named Alva Vanderbilt threatened to murder her daughter's lover. She staged a heart attack. She wielded guilt and religion and fear until the young woman broke. Consuelo Vanderbilt wept behind her veil at the altar. The Duke of Marlborough collected his $2,500,000 dowry and immediately admitted he loved another woman. The transaction was complete. But before Marble House became infamous as the place where love died and deals were finalized, this stretch of Rhode Island coastline was nothing at all. Before we step inside one of America's most beautiful prisons, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below, and if you're fascinated by the dark secrets hidden inside gilded mansions, make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what we uncover next. Chapter 1. The Dust and the Dream. In the decades before Marble House rose on Bellevue Avenue, Newport existed in American consciousness as a footnote. The town had been founded in 1639 by religious dissenters seeking freedom from Massachusetts Bay Colony's Puritan orthodoxy. For 2 centuries, it functioned as a modest port city, its economy built on shipping and trade. The Revolutionary War brought British occupation and economic devastation. By the 1820s, Newport had faded into obscurity, while Boston, New York, and Philadelphia surged forward. The transformation began quietly. In the 1850s, a handful of wealthy Southern plantation owners discovered Newport's mild summers and ocean breezes offered relief from the suffocating heat of Charleston and Savannah. They built modest summer homes and established a small seasonal community. The Civil War ended that briefly. Southern money evaporated. The plantation owners disappeared. But Northern industrialists, newly enriched by wartime manufacturing and railroad expansion, took their place. By the 1870s, Newport had become something unprecedented in American life. Families with surnames like Astor, Belmont, and Vanderbilt arrived each June and departed each September, compressing an entire social season into 3 months. They called their summer residences cottages, a deliberately modest term for structures that contained 40, 50, 60 rooms. The word suggested informality and leisure. The buildings themselves suggested something else entirely. They were palaces disguised as homes, monuments disguised as vacation retreats. The competition intensified through the 1880s. Each summer brought larger cottages, more elaborate parties, more aggressive displays of wealth. Carolyn Astor, the undisputed queen of New York society, maintained her Newport residence at Beechwood. Her approval could make a social career. Her exclusion could destroy one. She kept a list of 400 families considered acceptable for polite society. Everyone else did not exist. The architecture itself became a battlefield. Early cottages had been built in the shingle style, comfortable wooden structures that blended with the New England landscape. But comfort was not the point. Dominance was the point. By 1888, when the most audacious cottage of all was about to begin construction, Newport had become an arena where America's wealthiest families waged war through limestone and marble, through ballrooms and gardens, through guest lists and strategic exclusions. The weapons were architecture and money and relentless social ambition. Into this arena came a woman who understood that in America, permanence could be purchased. Her name was Alva Smith, and she was about to build something that would make every other cottage look modest. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Demanded a Palace. Alva Erskine Smith was born in Mobile, Alabama, on January 17, 1853, into a family that had everything except money. Her father, Murray Forbes Smith, had made and lost a cotton fortune when the Civil War destroyed the Southern economy. Her mother, Phoebe Ann Desha, came from prominent Kentucky lineage that provided social credentials but no cash. The family moved to New York City when Alva was 4 years old, occupying that uncomfortable position of genteel poverty, where invitations arrived but bills could not be paid. The defining years came between ages 8 and 14, when Murray Smith relocated the family to Paris while attempting various failed business ventures. Those 6 years in France shaped everything that followed. Alva absorbed French language, French manners, French architecture, and most importantly, French aristocratic obsession. She learned that in Europe, bloodlines mattered more than money. She learned that titles conferred permanent status. She learned to want what America could not give her. The family returned to New York when Alva was 14. She had social connections through her mother's Kentucky relatives and her father's former business associates. But she had no fortune. What she possessed instead was strategic brilliance and absolute ruthlessness about obtaining what she wanted. On April 20th, 1875, at age 22, she married William Kissam Vanderbilt in a ceremony at Calvary Church. William K. Vanderbilt was the grandson of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, the steamship and railroad magnate who had died in 1877 as the richest man in America. The Commodore's fortune of $105 million, approximately $2.5 billion today, had been divided among his heirs. William K. received a substantial portion through his father, William Henry Vanderbilt. By the time of his marriage, William K. controlled assets worth approximately $200 million in 1875 currency. Alva had married money. Now she would weaponize it. The Vanderbilt name carried wealth but not social legitimacy. New York's old families, led by Caroline Astor, considered the Vanderbilts vulgar new money, unworthy of inclusion in refined society. Alva recognized that acceptance could not be requested. It had to be forced. In 1879, she commissioned architect Richard Morris Hunt to design a mansion at 665th Avenue in New York City. The $3 million French chateau, completed in 1882, became the site of her master stroke. On March 26, 1883, Alva hosted a costume ball at the Fifth Avenue mansion. She invited 1,100 guests, nearly 3 times Caroline Astor's sacred 400. She spent $150,000 on a single night's entertainment. And she executed a calculated maneuver that would become legendary. Caroline Astor's daughter desperately wanted to attend. Alva refused to send an invitation, citing the fact that Mrs. Astor had never formally called on Mrs. Vanderbilt. For weeks, New York society held its breath. Finally, Caroline Astor capitulated. She arrived at the Fifth Avenue mansion in her carriage, left her calling card, and acknowledged Alva Vanderbilt as her social equal. The ball proceeded. The Vanderbilts had arrived. But Alva understood that victory required consolidation. New York was won. Newport remained. In 1888, she convinced William K. to fund the construction of a summer cottage that would dwarf every structure on Bellevue Avenue. She chose architect Richard Morris Hunt, who had proven his ability with the Fifth Avenue mansion. She selected a site with ocean frontage and began planning something unprecedented. This would not be wood, it would be marble. It would not suggest comfort. It would demand submission. She would build the most expensive house in America. And 15 years later, she would lock her daughter inside it until that daughter agreed to a transaction that would shock even Newport's jaded society. Chapter 3. 500,000 cubic feet of marble construction began in 1888. What Richard Morris Hunt designed was not a house. It was a declaration of war rendered in marble. Hunt had been born in 1827 and trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the first American architect to receive that prestigious education. He had already designed the Vanderbilts' New York mansion, and he understood Alva's ambitions perfectly. She wanted Versailles. He would give it to her. The architectural model was the Petit Trianon, the small palace built at Versailles between 1762 and 1768 for Madame de Pompadour, mistress to Louis XV. Hunt adapted its Beaux-Arts neoclassical style, its symmetrical facade, its classical columns and elaborate cornice work, but he executed it at a scale and cost that would have astonished even French royalty. The structure would contain 50 rooms spread across 110,000 square feet of floor space. 4 stories rose above the coastal landscape, and every exterior surface would be clad in white marble. The marble arrived in Newport between 1888 and 1892. Shipload after shipload from 3 continents. The material came from Italy, from Africa, from Algeria. Yellow sienna marble for the grand staircase, pink Numidian marble from North Africa for the dining room walls, red and green marble from Algeria for decorative accents. The exterior used white marble quarried in Italy and transported across the Atlantic in shipholds, then hauled by wagon from Newport's docks to the construction site on Bellevue Avenue. The logistics were extraordinary. European craftsmen were imported specifically for specialized work. Italian marble cutters shaped the stone. French artisans applied gold leaf. German metalworkers cast bronze fixtures. American laborers provided the muscle for foundation work and structural assembly, the coordination required to manage workers speaking 4 languages while constructing a palace on a construction timeline of 4 years demonstrated organizational genius. The costs escalated beyond any previous American residential project. The structure itself consumed $7 million. Interior furnishings, including the $1 million spent on the Gold Room alone, added another $4 million. The total expenditure of $11 million, approximately $387 million in current currency, was being spent on a building that would be occupied 6 to 8 weeks per year. William K. Vanderbilt had initially resisted. Alva insisted. She always insisted, and she always prevailed. The money meant nothing to her except as a tool. What mattered was the permanence. Marriages ended, social positions shifted, but buildings remained. Marble endured. Hunt died in 1895, 3 years after completing Marble House. He never saw what the building would become. He designed it as Alva's triumph, a monument to her victory over Carolyn Astor and New York society. The Gold Room with its ceiling covered in 22-karat gold leaf, its walls dripping with gilded moldings, its 50-foot length designed to accommodate 200 guests for balls and entertainments. The grand staircase rising through the center of the house, its yellow sienna marble gleaming, its bronze railings elaborately scrolled. The dining room where 30 guests could be seated formally beneath pink Numidian marble walls. The Gothic Room with its carved oak paneling, the only major space not dominated by marble, designed as a medieval retreat where one might escape the relentless grandeur of the rest of the house. When Marble House opened in the summer of 1892, it accomplished exactly what Alva intended. Every other Newport cottage suddenly looked inadequate. Visitors walked through rooms where marble covered every surface, where gold glittered on every ceiling, where European palace standards had been imported and exceeded. The message was unmistakable. The Vanderbilts had not merely arrived. They had conquered. But the building's most infamous purpose was still 3 years away. Chapter 4. The Gold Room and the Social Wars. A summer day at Marble House in August of 1893 required 35 servants to execute properly. The staff arrived from New York with the family in early June and departed with them in late August. A head butler supervised 2 assistant butlers who managed 6 to 8 footmen. A housekeeper commanded 4 to 6 maids who maintained rooms that could never show dust, never display a crooked cushion, never reveal any evidence of the labor required to sustain them. The kitchen employed a chef trained in France, 2 sous chefs, and 4 kitchen maids preparing meals that would be served on china purchased in 1,000-piece sets. Laundresses worked in basement rooms, washing linens by hand. Groundskeepers maintained 12 acres of tropical vegetation that had no business surviving in Rhode Island's climate, but flourished anyway through constant irrigation and care. Alva's day began at 9 in the morning, with breakfast served in her private rooms. By 10, she was reviewing correspondence and issuing instructions to the housekeeper about that day's arrangements. At 11, she received morning callers in the main parlor, limiting each visitor to exactly 30 minutes before the next arrival. The ritual was precise. Cards were presented. Tea was served. Conversation touched on acceptable topics only. Politics, business, and genuine emotion were forbidden. At 12:30, Alva withdrew to change for lunch. Luncheon at 1 o'clock might host 8 to 12 guests, seated in the dining room beneath those pink Numidian marble walls. The meal lasted 90 minutes. Afterward, the expected routine required a carriage drive along Ocean Drive, where one could be seen by others taking their afternoon promenades. Being seen mattered more than seeing. At 4 o'clock, tea was served again. More visitors arrived. More cards were exchanged. By 6 o'clock, the elaborate process of dressing for dinner began. Formal dinners started at 8 and often included 20 to 30 guests. After dinner, entertainment moved to the Gold Room. The Gold Room was the heart of Marble House's social function. 50 feet long, its walls and ceiling covered in $1 million worth of gold leaf, it could accommodate 200 guests for balls and musical performances. The room had cost more than most Newport cottages in their entirety. Bronze sculptures stood in alcoves. Gilded moldings framed every surface. Crystal chandeliers refracted light across gold until the entire space seemed to glow. When Alva hosted a ball, orchestras played until 1 or 2 in the morning. Guests danced, negotiated marriages for their children, destroyed reputations through carefully placed gossip, and waged the social warfare that justified their existence. Carolyn Astor attended events at Marble House. Her presence signaled Alva's complete victory. The woman who had once refused to acknowledge the Vanderbilts now accepted their invitations and walked through their palace. The Belmonts came. The Whitneys came. European nobility visiting America came. An invitation to Marble House conferred status. Exclusion suggested irrelevance. But beneath the gilt and marble, the cottage served a colder purpose. This was not about hospitality. It was about control. Alva wielded guest lists like weapons. She granted access or denied it based on strategic calculations that had nothing to do with friendship and everything to do with social dominance. The building itself enforced hierarchy. The grandeur reminded every visitor of Vanderbilt wealth and Alva's power to deploy it. The Gothic Room, tucked away from the main entertaining spaces, offered a different atmosphere. Its carved oak walls and medieval-inspired design suggested retreat, a space where one might escape the relentless performance required everywhere else in the house. Consuelo Vanderbilt, Alva's daughter, sometimes spent hours there reading. The room would later become famous for a different reason. But in 1893, it was simply the library, a quiet space in a house built for spectacle. Marble House was not built for happiness. It was built for dominance, and Alva was about to demonstrate exactly how far she would go to maintain it. Chapter 5. The Daughter and the Lover. Consuelo Vanderbilt was born on March 2, 1877, into a world that would give her everything except the right to choose. She grew up in the Fifth Avenue mansion, surrounded by servants and tutors, educated in languages and arts and the performance of being a Vanderbilt heiress. Her mother named her after a Spanish duchess, a signal of the European aristocratic ambitions that consumed Alva's imagination. The child would become the instrument of those ambitions. By age 18, Consuelo stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, slender and dark-haired, considered beautiful by Gilded age standards. She had been trained to speak French fluently, to paint watercolors competently, to perform piano adequately, and to understand that her purpose was not personal fulfillment, but family advancement. She was intelligent, sensitive, artistic. She was also obedient, raised by a mother whose will had never been successfully opposed. The romance began at Newport during the social season. Winthrop Rutherford was a New York socialite 10 years older than Consuelo, handsome and charming, from a family with old American money and respectable social standing. They met at parties, danced at balls, took chaperoned walks along the cliff walk. The attraction was genuine. For perhaps the first time in her carefully controlled life, Consuelo felt something that had not been prescribed by her mother's ambitions. Rutherford proposed. Consuelo accepted. They believed, with the naivete of people who had never successfully opposed Alva Vanderbilt, that love would be sufficient justification. They were wrong. Alva had other plans. She had spent years cultivating connections with European aristocracy. She had studied the marriage market, where impoverished English dukes traded ancient titles for American industrial fortunes. She knew exactly what a Vanderbilt daughter was worth. Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, was 23 years old in 1895. He owned Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, 187,000 square feet of English Baroque architecture, where Winston Churchill would be born. The palace was magnificent. It was also crumbling. The Duke's inheritance included debts, maintenance costs that exceeded his income, and social obligations that required money he did not possess. He needed an American heiress. Alva needed a title for her daughter. The match was perfect in every way, except the one that mattered to Consuelo. Alva rejected Winthrop Rutherford with absolute clarity. He was not grand enough. He had no title, only American respectability. He could not provide what Alva wanted, which was a daughter addressed as _quote _ 0 _, and a connection to English aristocracy that would cement the Vanderbilt's social position permanently. When Consuelo resisted, when she pleaded to be allowed to marry the man she loved, Alva deployed the weapons that had won every previous battle: intimidation, manipulation, force. In June of 1895, Alva discovered that Consuelo and Winthrop planned to marry, despite her opposition. What happened next in the Gothic Room of Marble House would haunt both women for the rest of their lives. Chapter 6. The Gothic Room becomes a cell. The Gothic Room of Marble House, with its carved oak walls and medieval atmosphere, became a prison in the summer of 1895. Consuelo was locked inside. The exact duration remains uncertain, sources varying between days and weeks, but the imprisonment lasted long enough to break her will. The room that had been designed as a peaceful library, a retreat from the Gold Room's relentless grandeur, became the site of psychological torture. Alva's tactics were comprehensive and brutal. She threatened to shoot Winthrop Rutherford if Consuelo refused the Duke. The threat was not hypothetical. Alva stated it clearly, repeatedly, until her daughter understood that her mother was capable of murder to prevent a marriage that did not advance Vanderbilt interests. Whether Alva would have actually committed murder was irrelevant. Consuelo believed she would, and belief was sufficient. When threats proved insufficient, Alva staged a heart attack. She collapsed dramatically, clutching her chest, gasping that Consuelo's disobedience was killing her. Doctors were summoned. The performance was convincing enough that even servants believed the emergency was genuine. Consuelo, trapped in the Gothic Room, received reports that her stubbornness was murdering her mother. The guilt was designed to be unbearable. Religious manipulation followed. Alva invoked Christian duty, family honor, social obligation. She framed Consuelo's desire to marry for love as selfishness, as betrayal, as sin against the family that had given her everything. The psychological assault continued day after day, week after week, until the young woman's resistance crumbled. Complete isolation was enforced. All communication with Winthrop Rutherford was prevented. Letters were intercepted. Visits were impossible. Consuelo was permitted no contact with anyone who might support her choice. The servants understood that their employment depended on absolute cooperation with Mrs. Vanderbilt's wishes. No one intervened. William Kissam Vanderbilt, Consuelo's father, was largely absent during the imprisonment. He was dealing with the divorce that Alva had initiated in March of 1895, filing on grounds of adultery. William K. would lose Marble House in the settlement. He would pay Alva $10 million, approximately $370 million today, to end the marriage. But he signed the documents approving Consuelo's marriage to the Duke. He authorized the financial arrangements. Whether he approved of the coercion or simply lacked the courage to oppose his soon-to-be former wife, the result was the same. He enabled it. Decades later, in her autobiography, The Glitter and the Gold, published in 1952, Consuelo would describe the imprisonment in language that left no ambiguity. I was forced into marriage. I was locked in my room and not allowed to see the man I loved. My mother told me she would shoot him if I refused the Duke. In 1926, testifying under oath before Catholic Church authorities during annulment proceedings, she provided even more detailed testimony about the intimidation, threats, and imprisonment. Legal records preserve her sworn statement that she was coerced through methods that violated her will completely. The breaking point came sometime in August. Consuelo agreed to marry the Duke of Marlborough. She surrendered not because she wanted to, not because she was convinced, but because the psychological assault had destroyed her capacity to resist. The Gothic Room's oak walls had witnessed everything. They absorbed her tears, her pleas, her final capitulation. Alva had won. The wedding was scheduled for November 6th, 1895, but winning this battle would cost Alva something she could not yet calculate. Chapter 7. The Bride Who Wept Behind Her Veil. The price for a duke was $2,500,000 in cash, $100,000 per year for life, and a young woman's happiness. The financial arrangements were negotiated like a business contract because that is exactly what they were. The Duke of Marlborough needed money to save Blenheim Palace. The Vanderbilts wanted a title. Consuelo was the currency that facilitated the exchange. The dowry included $2,500,000 in cash, approximately $93 million in current currency. An additional annual income of $100,000, approximately $3,700,000 today, would be provided to the Duke for the rest of his life, regardless of whether the marriage survived. Railway stock that generated income was added to the package. The total value of the financial arrangement approached $10 to $15 million in 1895 currency. William Kissam Vanderbilt signed the documents. The Duke of Marlborough signed the documents. Consuelo's signature was obtained. The transaction was complete. The wedding took place on November 6, 1895 at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue in New York City. 2,000 guests filled the pews. Every important family in New York society attended. The press covered the event as the social moment of the decade. The New York Times devoted extensive coverage to what it called, quote, "three wedding of the year," describing the flowers, the music, the guests' elaborate costumes. Sinew and the bride's worth gown imported from Paris. But the Times also noted something else. Consuelo appeared quote, _4, throughout the ceremony. Her quote, _5, struck multiple observers as unusual for a bride. She wore a veil that concealed her face, a traditional element of wedding attire that in this case served a different purpose. Behind that veil, Consuelo wept. Witnesses who stood close enough described her as trembling at the altar. One guest would later recall that she looked like quote, _6, present in body, but absent in spirit. The ceremony proceeded according to Episcopal ritual. Vows were spoken, rings were exchanged. The Duke of Marlborough and the new Duchess of Marlborough walked down the aisle as man and wife. 2,000 guests applauded. Alva Vanderbilt, dressed in Worth designs that had cost thousands of dollars, stood in the front pew and watched her daughter complete the transaction that would link the Vanderbilts to English aristocracy permanently. The honeymoon began immediately. According to Consuelo's later accounts, the Duke's true feelings were revealed almost immediately. On their honeymoon, he told her that he was in love with another woman. Her name was Gladys Deacon, an American expatriate living in Europe. The Duke admitted that he had married Consuelo only for the money, that his heart belonged to someone else, that this arrangement was purely financial. Whether he intended cruelty or simply saw no point in pretending, the effect on his 18-year-old bride was devastating. The most expensive wedding of the decade united two people who did not love each other, financed the restoration of an English palace, and destroyed any possibility of Consuelo Vanderbilt's happiness. The Duke got his money. Alva got her title. Consuelo got a marriage that was a prison from its first day. The exchange was finalized. Marble House had served its purpose. Chapter 8. The Duchess and the Suffragette. The woman who had denied her daughter the right to choose her own husband became one of America's most prominent voices for women's rights. The irony was lost on no one, except apparently Alva herself. In 1895, she had finalized her divorce from William Kissam Vanderbilt. The settlement gave her Marble House outright and $10 million in cash. She had won both the cottage and the fortune. In January of 1896, she married Oliver Belmont, a wealthy man whose banking and racing fortune provided additional resources and social standing. She preferred his estate to Marble House for several years. The palace she had built sat largely unused. Oliver Belmont died in 1908. Alva returned to Marble House the following year, reclaiming it as her primary summer residence. But the woman who emerged from widowhood was different from the one who had locked her daughter in the Gothic Room 14 years earlier. In 1909, Alva founded the Political Equality League, dedicating herself to securing voting rights for women. By 1914, she had become a major supporter of the National Woman's Party, donating money and prestige to the suffragette cause. She repurposed Marble House for political organizing. The Gold Room that had hosted balls for Newport society now hosted rallies for women's suffrage. Activists gathered beneath the gold-leaf ceiling to plan campaigns, coordinate protests, and strategize about forcing the federal government to grant women the vote. In 1913, Alva built the Chinese Tea House on Marble House's grounds, a whimsical structure decorated with dragons and oriental motifs. It too became a venue for suffragette meetings. Alva spoke publicly about women's autonomy, about the right to self-determination, about freedom from male control. She championed the cause with the same ruthless energy she had once devoted to social dominance. She donated enormous sums. She marched in parades. She gave speeches declaring that women deserved the same rights as men. She never publicly acknowledged the contradiction between her political activism and what she had done to Consuelo. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Consuelo lived at Blenheim Palace. 187 rooms surrounded her. She performed the duties required of a Duchess of Marlborough, hosting parties, managing households, representing the family at social functions. In 1897, she gave birth to John Albert Spencer Churchill, who would eventually become the 10th Duke of Marlborough. In 1898, she produced a second son, Lord Ivor Spencer Churchill. She had fulfilled her primary obligation, providing an heir and a spare to continue the line. The marriage was miserable from the start and deteriorated further with each year. In 1906, after 11 years, Consuelo and the Duke separated. They would not divorce until 1921, 26 years after the wedding, but the relationship had failed long before legal dissolution. Consuelo had done everything required of her. She had married the Duke, she had lived in his palace, she had produced his children, she had endured a loveless marriage purchased with Vanderbilt money. The Blenheim Palace renovations had been completed, funded by her dowry. The transaction had succeeded in every way except the one that involved human happiness. The house where a daughter had been imprisoned became the house where women's freedom was championed. Alva saw no contradiction. She defended the Marlborough marriage publicly as a strategic necessity, a brilliant arrangement that had elevated the Vanderbilt family into English aristocracy. She expressed no regret. She offered no apology. When asked about Consuelo's unhappiness, she suggested that duty mattered more than personal satisfaction. History has been less forgiving. Chapter 9. The Testimony. On a day in 1926, Consuelo Vanderbilt Balsan sat before Catholic Church authorities and swore under oath that she had been forced into marriage through intimidation, threats, and imprisonment. The occasion was an annulment petition, an appeal to the Church to declare that her marriage to the Duke of Marlborough had never been valid in the eyes of God. Catholic annulments were rarely granted to divorced persons. The Church required extraordinary evidence of coercion or fraud. Consuelo provided it. Her divorce from the Duke had been finalized in 1921 after years of legal maneuvering. Within months, she married Lieutenant Colonel Jacques Balsan, a French aviator and war hero. The marriage was everything the first had not been. Balsan was charming, kind, genuinely in love with her. They lived primarily in France, splitting time between Paris and Balsan's country estate. For the first time since 1895, Consuelo was happy. But she wanted the annulment for reasons beyond personal satisfaction. She wanted legal and religious vindication of what had been done to her. She wanted the record to show that she had not chosen the Duke, that the marriage had been forced, that her will had been violated. In 1926, she filed the petition and provided detailed testimony about the imprisonment in the Gothic Room, her mother's threats to murder Winthrop Rutherford, the staged heart attack, the psychological manipulation that had broken her resistance, The testimony was given under oath. Lying to church authorities would constitute perjury and mortal sin. Consuelo swore that she had been coerced into the marriage through intimidation, threats, and imprisonment by her mother. She described being locked in her room, being prevented from communicating with the man she loved, being told repeatedly that refusing the Duke would result in violence. She stated that she had wept at the altar, that she had never wanted to marry the Duke of Marlborough, that she had capitulated only because further resistance had become psychologically impossible. The Catholic Church investigated. They interviewed witnesses. They reviewed the circumstances. In 1926, they granted the annulment, one of very few granted to divorced persons during that era. The decision validated everything Consuelo had testified. The marriage had never been valid because consent had been coerced. What had appeared to be a willing bride accepting a duke had actually been a young woman broken by systematic psychological torture. The annulment gave Consuelo legal and religious vindication 31 years after the wedding. But she was not finished telling the story. In 1952, at age 75, she published her autobiography, The Glitter and the Gold. The book described her childhood, her imprisonment, the forced marriage, and the decades that followed. It was written in elegant prose that nonetheless made the violence clear. Consuelo had waited 57 years to tell the public what her mother had done to her. Alva had died in January of 1933 in Paris at age 80. She had lived long enough to see women gain the vote with ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. She had witnessed her political triumph. She had never publicly acknowledged that she had denied her own daughter the autonomy she fought to secure for other women. She died without reconciling with Consuelo, without apologizing, without apparently recognizing any contradiction between her suffragette activism and her parental tyranny. Consuelo lived to be 87 years old. She died in 1964 in New York. She had 57 years of freedom after her forced marriage ended. She had decades of happiness with Jacques Balsan, who had died in 1956. She had children who loved her and grandchildren who knew her story. But the Gothic Room of Marble House haunted her until she died. Chapter 10. When Palaces Became Worthless. The stock market crashed in October of 1929. Within 4 years, the house that had cost $11 million to build would sell for $100,000. The Great Depression that followed the crash devastated luxury real estate markets across America. Properties that had seemed like permanent monuments to wealth suddenly became unsustainable burdens. Annual operating costs exceeded any possible return. Taxes devoured whatever income remained. Mansions that had required 40 servants could not be maintained with 4. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont died on January 26, 1933, in her Paris apartment. She had spent increasing amounts of time in France during her final years, preferring European sophistication to American excess. Her estate faced immediate problems regarding Marble House. The cottage required approximately $100,000 annually, just for basic maintenance, approximately $2,300,000 in current currency. Heating, staffing, repairs, taxes, and groundskeeping consumed money at rates that made no economic sense during a depression. The estate sold Marble House in 1933 to Frederick Henry Prince, a Boston Railroad executive and financier. The sale price was $100,000, less than 1% of the original construction cost. Even accounting for the Depression's impact on asset values, the loss was catastrophic. A building that had cost $11 million 31 years earlier sold for a sum that would not have covered the Gold Room's restoration alone. Prince maintained the property, but did not restore it. He used Marble House as a summer residence in the traditional Newport pattern, arriving in June and departing in September. The building remained magnificent but began showing signs of deferred maintenance. Paint faded, marble weathered. The tropical gardens required constant care that was no longer provided at previous levels. The palace survived, but barely. Other Newport cottages fared worse. During the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, mansion after mansion was demolished. Pembroke Jones's estate. Sherwood was razed in the 1960s. Developers purchased properties, demolished the structures, and subdivided the land for smaller residential lots. The economics were simple. The land was valuable. The buildings were expensive burdens. Demolition made financial sense. Marble House nearly joined the casualty list. Real estate developers approached the Prince family repeatedly with offers to purchase the property, demolish the structure, and subdivide the 1-acre lot. The marble could be salvaged and sold. The land could generate far more revenue as multiple residential lots than as a single oversized cottage. The only factor preventing immediate demolition was Prince's sentimental attachment and his ability to absorb ongoing losses. For 30 years, Marble House survived through neglect rather than love. Frederick Prince kept the building standing, but he did not restore its glory. By 1963, survival had become a question of will rather than resources. Would anyone care enough to save it? Chapter 11. The Salvation. In 1963, Frederick Prince's family made a decision that saved Marble House. They gave it away. The donation to the Preservation Society of Newport County was motivated partly by tax benefits that exceeded any potential sale price, and partly by recognition that the building had historical value beyond its function as a private residence. The Preservation Society had been operating the Breakers, the Vanderbilt family's even larger Newport cottage, as a museum since 1948. The model worked. Tour revenue covered operating costs. The public got access to Gilded Age history. The buildings were preserved. The Preservation Society accepted Marble House and immediately began emergency repairs. Decades of deferred maintenance had created structural problems. The roof needed restoration. The marble exterior required cleaning to remove years of accumulated pollution and weathering. Windows had to be repaired. Climate control systems had to be installed to preserve furnishings and prevent further deterioration. The work was expensive and essential. The Gold Room restoration became the most ambitious and costly project. In the 1980s, the Preservation Society undertook complete regilding of the room's walls and ceiling. The 22-karat gold leaf had to be reapplied using techniques that matched the original 1892 application. European craftsmen were hired for the specialized work. The restoration cost approximately $2 to $3 million for a single room, but the result was extraordinary. The Gold Room gleamed exactly as it had when Alva first opened Marble House to Newport society. Interior restoration continued through the 1990s. Original paint colors were researched and reapplied. Furniture was conserved using museum-quality techniques. Textiles, including curtains and upholstery, received careful restoration. The goal was not to make Marble House look new, but to make it look as it had during its peak years from 1892 through 1895. The Gothic Room received particular attention. The carved oak paneling was cleaned and restored. The medieval atmosphere was preserved. By the 2000s, the room looked much as it had in the summer of 1895, when Consuelo had been imprisoned there. Tour guides began mentioning that history, gradually incorporating the darker aspects of Marble House's story into the narrative visitors heard. In 1991, Marble House received designation as a National Historic Landmark, federal recognition of its architectural and historical significance. The designation provided some protection and access to potential federal preservation funds, though most financing continued to come from the Preservation Society's fundraising and tour revenue. The Chinese tea house that Alva had built in 1913 received full restoration in 2012. The whimsical structure with its dragons and oriental design elements became an additional attraction. Visitors could tour both the main house and the tea house, experiencing the full scope of what Alva had created over her decades of ownership. Today, Marble House attracts approximately 100,000 to 150,000 visitors annually. It is one of Newport's most visited historic properties, second only to the Breakers in total attendance. Tour revenue helps support ongoing maintenance and preservation work. The Preservation Society manages 11 historic properties across Newport, creating an economic ecosystem where popular attractions subsidize less visited but equally important sites. The house that Alva built to dominate society now welcomes anyone with $32 for admission. The transformation was complete, but the most important change was still to come. Chapter 12. The Room Where They Lock the Door. Walk through Marble House today, and the tour guide will stop at the Gothic Room. The voice will drop slightly. "This is where Alva locked Consuelo," the guide will say. "This is where a mother imprisoned her daughter until she agreed to marry for money." The room has become the emotional center of the tour, the space where visitors confront the human cost of Gilded Age ambition. The evolution of how Marble House is interpreted reflects broader cultural changes in how Americans understand wealth and power. In the 1960s and 70s, when the Preservation Society first opened the property to public tours, the focus was almost entirely architectural. Guides described the marble's origins, the gold leaf's application, Richard Morris Hunt's design genius. Alva was presented as a brilliant social strategist. Consuelo's story was mentioned briefly, if at all, and often romanticized as a fairy tale marriage to European nobility. By the 1990s and 2000s, the narrative began shifting. Guides started incorporating Consuelo's perspective, acknowledging that the marriage had been unhappy, mentioning that she had later written about being pressured. The language remained somewhat careful, avoiding the harshest accusations, but the door to more honest interpretation had opened. In the 2010s and 2020s, the interpretation changed dramatically. Contemporary tour guides now explicitly discuss coercion, imprisonment, and psychological torture. They reference Consuelo's autobiography and her sworn testimony during annulment proceedings. They connect the story to contemporary conversations about consent, autonomy, and the abuse of parental power. Younger visitors in particular have responded strongly to this framing, seeing parallels to modern discussions about bodily autonomy and women's rights. Social media amplified the shift. In 2023 and 2024, TikTok and Instagram content about _quote_10_ went viral. Millions of people, many of them young women, encountered the story through short videos that emphasized the imprisonment and forced marriage. Comment sections filled with outrage at Alva's actions and sympathy for Consuelo. Visitors began arriving at Marble House specifically to see the Gothic Room, to stand in the space where a young woman's will had been broken. The Preservation Society adapted its interpretation to reflect visitor interest. Quote, 11 tours now include extended discussions of the Consuelo story, providing additional details about the imprisonment, the wedding, and the annulment testimony. Educational programming connects Marble House to broader discussions about Gilded Age gender dynamics, marriage as economic transaction, and the limited options available to even wealthy women in the 1890s. The tension inherent in presenting Marble House has become more explicit. The building is undeniably an architectural masterpiece. Richard Morris Hunt created something extraordinary. The craftsmanship is remarkable. The materials are priceless. The design demonstrates sophisticated understanding of Beaux-Arts principles, but it is also the site of documented abuse. A mother imprisoned her daughter here. A young woman wept behind these marble walls. Beauty and cruelty coexist in the same space. Tour guides navigate this tension by presenting both truths. They describe the Gold Room's magnificence while noting that it hosted the suffragette meetings of a woman who had denied her own daughter autonomy. They admire the marble staircase while acknowledging that the money that built it came from a marriage that was essentially a financial transaction. They point out the Gothic Room's beautiful oak paneling and then describe what happened there in the summer of 1895. Visitor responses vary. Some come for the architecture and leave disturbed by the human story. Others come for Consuelo's story and are surprised by the building's beauty. Most leave understanding that history is complicated, that magnificent buildings can be monuments to both achievement and abuse, that the Gilded Age's glamour concealed profound cruelty. Marble House is no longer a monument to Alva's ambition. It is a monument to Consuelo's suffering. The building Alva designed to prove her power now proves something else entirely. Coercion leaves marks that marble cannot hide. Today, Marble House stands on Bellevue Avenue exactly as it has stood since 1892. 500,000 cubic feet of marble still gleam white against the Rhode Island sky. The Gold Room still blazes with $1 million worth of gold leaf. 12 acres of tropical gardens still flourish where they should not. The building has survived everything: depression, neglect, The threat of demolition, decades of deferred maintenance. It has outlasted its builders and its victims. But the story it tells has changed. For decades, Marble House was presented as Alva's triumph, a monument to ambition and architectural genius. Now it is remembered as Consuelo's prison, the place where a young woman's will was broken and her life was sold. The truth is both and neither. Marble House is one of America's finest examples of Beaux-Arts architecture. It is also the scene of documented psychological torture. Richard Morris Hunt created a masterpiece. Alva Vanderbilt weaponized it. Consuelo Vanderbilt survived it. And every visitor who walks through the Gothic Room now walks through the place where beauty and cruelty met. The walls remember everything. They witnessed Consuelo's tears in the summer of 1895. They witnessed Alva's suffragette rallies 20 years later. They survived the depression that should have destroyed them. They opened to the public and revealed secrets that had been hidden for generations. The Chinese tea house still stands in the gardens where Alva built it in 1913. The Preservation Society still maintains the property, still guides visitors through rooms that cost more than most people will earn in their lifetimes, still tells the story of what happened here. Marble House can be visited year-round. Tours run daily, except major holidays. Admission costs $32 for adults, with combination tickets available for multiple Newport properties. The Gothic Room is accessible. Visitors can stand in the space where Consuelo was imprisoned, can see the oak walls that witnessed her capitulation, can imagine what it meant to be locked inside beauty until your spirit broke. The building serves as evidence that secrets eventually surface. The truth outlasts those who try to bury it. Consuelo waited 57 years to publish her autobiography, but the story emerged. The Catholic Church validated her testimony. Historians documented the coercion, and now hundreds of thousands of visitors every year learn what happened in the Gothic Room, what the $11 million really purchased, what price was paid for social dominance. Marble House, where a mother imprisoned her daughter, where marble witnessed a transaction, where the most expensive house in America became the most famous prison, where beauty was built on suffering, where ambition consumed love, where the walls absorbed everything and forgot nothing. Still standing, still beautiful, still haunted.